Hi, Seagull class. I'll read chapter 3 from Who Was Sacagawea by Judith Bloom Freyden and Dennis Brindle Freyden. Chapter 3, Byrd Woman's River. The winter of 1804 to 1805 was very cold. At sunrise on January 9th, it was 21 degrees below zero. And the next morning it was 40 degrees below zero. No wonder the Indians called this time of year frost in the teepee. The people at Fort Mandan tried to stay warm and find food, but the hunters had little luck. Fortunately, Mandan Indians from nearby villages traded corn to the explorers. The Mandan also showed the voyagers how they made blue glass beads. Indians called these chief beads. Tribes in the Northwest used them as money. The beads were also worn as hair decorations, earrings, and necklaces. Sacagawea had a belt of blue beads, and it was her prized possession. Early in April, Lewis and Clark sent home some men and a barge back to President Jefferson. The boat carried souvenirs for the president. These included a prairie dog, 4 magpies, many newly discovered plants, and an Indian robe. In the meantime, the men at Fort Mandan were busy. They had built new boats so that they could continue their long journey to the ocean. The boats were loaded with food and other supplies. On April 7th, the voyagers, including Sacagawea, Charbonneau, and Pomp, left Fort Mandan. They rowed up the Missouri River in 6 small canoes and in 2 boats that were long, narrow rowboats with sails. As they paddled west, every traveler but one was leaving home farther behind. Only Sacagawea was heading towards home. For 5 years she had not seen her family or friends. She had been enslaved, first by the Minotari and then by Charbonneau. Now, thanks to Lewis and Clark, she was headed back to the land of her birth. Would she meet her people there? Were her family and friends still alive? What would they think of her baby? Sometimes Sacagawea rowed in one of the boats, but often she walked along the shore with Clark. Pomp traveled in a cradleboard on his mother's back. At night, Sacagawea and her family shared a tent with the 2 captains and York. Clark came from a large, loving family, and he quickly grew fond of Sacagawea and Pomp. And he soon saw that letting Sacagawea come along had been a very wise decision. On their 3rd day out of Fort Mandan, Sacagawea found some tasty wild artichokes while on the shore. She cooked these roots for dinner. Sacagawea found many kinds of plant foods during their expedition, and among them were currants and gooseberries. 5 weeks later, Sacagawea prevented a disaster. May 14th, 1805 was very foggy. Lewis and Clark were walking along the Missouri River, and Sacagawea, who had Pomp on her back, was in one of the boats. Her husband was steering. Several other men were also in the boat, and they were 300 feet from shore, when suddenly a gust of wind upset the boat, and it quickly filled with water. Charbonneau cried out that he couldn't swim. As the other men desperately bailed out of the boat, Sacagawea saw their supplies floating away. Clark later wrote in his journal, "A squall of wind struck our sail broadside and turned the boat nearly over. The articles which floated out were nearly all caught by Sacagawea. In this boat were our papers, instruments, books, medicine, and in short, almost every article necessary to ensure the success of the enterprise. Had she not saved the supplies, the expedition might have had to turn back. The captains wanted to honor Sacagawea, so they named a creek in central Montana for her. This stream we called Byrd Woman's River, after our interpreter, the Snake Woman, wrote Lewis, and on maps it's called the Sacagawea River. The Missouri River became swifter and clearer as they approached the mountains. Cottonwood and willow trees line the river banks. In the distance, pines and junipers topped the higher land. But higher land also meant colder temperatures, so at night, water in the kettles crusted with ice, even though it was late May. Rain and snow made traveling difficult, but there were plenty of deer and buffalo to hunt. The explorers stored the meat in their canoes. The men pulling the loaded canoes had to wade in icy water up to their armpits, and the ground was also very mucky. Those on the shore had to take off their moccasins and walk barefoot. Well, hardly a day passed without problems. Captain Clark and Sacagawea were almost bitten by rattlesnakes. Mosquitoes stung them in and turned Pomp's little body into a mass of red sores. One man after another came down with the flu or fevers. In the Jefferson River, as the water became shallow, the Corps had to pull their boats with cords made out of elk hide. Sacagawea began running a fever around June 1st, and as she grew worse, the captains feared that she would die. They were also afraid that the expedition would fail without her. How would they trade for horses without their Shoshone translator? Without horses, how would they get across the Bitterroot Mountains? And who would take care of Pomp if his mother died? Clark wrote in his journal on June 16th, 1805, "The Indian woman, very bad and out of her senses." The captains took turns caring for Sacagawea. They gave her tea made of tree bark. They brought her an iron-rich water from springs, but it wasn't until June 24th that she felt better. By then, the expedition had reached the Great Falls of the Missouri River. These waterfalls drop 400 feet. The voyagers could not go up the falls in their boats. They had to drag their boats around them. This is called portaging. They placed the boats on wheels made from slices of tree trunks. The men then pushed and pulled the boats across the hard ground. Cactus thorns sliced the bottoms of their feet right through their moccasins. Grizzly bears sniffed around their camp at night. Lewis's dog, Seaman, barked all night to scare the bears away. Then storms hit. The worst storm struck on June 29th. Sacagawea, carrying Pomp, was walking along a dry creek bed. Charbonneau and Clark were with her. As rain began to fall, the group hid under a rock shelf. The shower turned into a downpour, and suddenly a flash flood roared down the ravine. In seconds, the rushing water was waist high. Pushing Sacagawea and Pomp ahead of him, Clark scrambled up the steep bluff. Charbonneau pulled Sacagawea up by her hand. They escaped just before the ravine filled up with 15 feet of water. Pomp's cradle board was swept away, but Sacagawea hung on to her baby. Meanwhile, giant hailstones pounded the main camp. Several men were hurt. One man was knocked down to the ground 3 times. Captain Lewis reported that the hailstones were as wide as 7 inches. They bounced 10 feet high after striking the ground. On July 1st, the portage was completed. The falls were now behind them. The men made 2 new canoes, and by burning and scraping out the insides of cottonwood trees. The voyagers continued up the Missouri River in their 8 canoes. By late July, the land began to look familiar to Sacagawea. Her excitement grew. After 5 years, she was coming back to her homeland. On July 22nd, they reached a creek that Sacagawea remembered that her people had camped in this very place. Soon after, she showed the men the exact spot where she had been kidnapped. Days passed, and there was still no sign of her people. The 2 captains grew desperate. They had counted on getting horses as guides from the Shoshone. If not, how would they cross the mountains? To make things worse, the men were exhausted. Their food was running low. Sacagawea, however, remained hopeful. When they reached a rock known as the Beaver's Head, she was sure that the Shoshone must be nearby. On August 1st, the explorers split into 2 groups to look for Sacagawea's tribe. Lewis led a small group by land. Sacagawea and her family stayed with Clark and the rest of the men. They continued on by canoe. Chapter 4, Coming Home. On the morning of August 13th, 1805, Lewis and his 3 men spotted 2 Shoshone women and a girl. The Indians bowed their heads. They expected to be killed. But Lewis spoke to them kindly. He gave them beads and mirrors. As a sign of peace, he also painted the Indians' cheeks red. The 3 Shoshone agreed to take Captain Lewis and his men to their village. They were on their way when 60 Shoshone warriors appeared on the horses. They thundered towards Lewis and his men. Their chief got off his horse and greeted Lewis with a hug. He then took the 4 strangers to his village. There, the explorers and Indians smoked peace pipes together. Lewis asked the chief to come meet the rest of the explorers. A Shoshone woman was with them, Lewis said. The chief agreed to go, but his warriors feared that Lewis was leading them into a trap. Meanwhile, approached with the main group, Sacagawea was walking along the riverbank. Suddenly, she saw several Indians on horses in the distance. Sacagawea stared at them. Then she began dancing with joy and sucking on her fingers. This was the Indian sign meaning, "These are my people." The Shoshone warriors were happy to see Sacagawea too. Now they knew that the white men meant no harm. Together, the Indians and the explorers headed towards the Shoshone village. When they were nearly there, a young woman pushed her way through the crowd. She hugged Sacagawea. They began talking excitedly. Sacagawea had found her dearest friend, the girl who had escaped from the Minatari. She had not seen her for 5 years. At the village, the captains met with the chief. Sacagawea had to translate. She had barely sat down when she looked at the chief. Weeping with joy, she rushed to him and threw her blanket over him as a token of love. The Shoshone chief was her brother. It was with Kamahowait. Kamahowait was happy to be with his long-lost sister. The brother and sister talked for a while. Then, Byrd woman sat down to translate. She was so overjoyed at seeing her brother that she kept bursting into tears. but the chief tried to act dignified. Sacagawea explained that the captains needed horses. Asking even simple questions was very hard, because they went from English to French to Minatari to Shoshone. The chief's answers went from Shoshone to Minatari to French and back to English until a deal was made. The explorers would give the Indians battle axes, knives, and clothing. In exchange, the chief would supply horses and guides. Now the expedition had a way to cross the Bitterroot Mountains. Sacagawea and the explorers spent several days with the Shoshone. Sacagawea learned some very sad news, that most of her family was dead. Kamehameha, another brother, and her sister's little boy were her only living relatives. She must have been tempted to stay with her people. However, she chose to move on with the Corps of Discovery. We can only guess why. Perhaps she felt loyal to the explorers. They had treated her and Pomp kindly. She may have never felt so important before. The chance to visit other Indian tribes and see the ocean must have also been exciting to a young girl. The explorers were still among the Shoshone when Sacagawea overheard something shocking. Her brother had changed his mind. He was going to break his promise. He was going to keep the horses and take his hungry people to hunt buffalo. Sacagawea told Charbonneau what she had learned, and she asked him to tell Captain Lewis. Lewis confronted the brother. The chief was ashamed. He would keep his word after all, he said. Once again, Sacagawea had helped save the expedition, because without horses, the explorers could not continue westward. In late August, the moon when the geese shed their feathers, Sacagawea said farewell to her family and friends. Now it was time for the explorers to start climbing the bitter roots. Chapter 5. To the Pacific. Crossing the bitter roots was difficult and dangerous. It began snowing. The ground was so slippery that several horses fell. Food was so scarce that Clark named a river Hungry Creek. Sacagawea was still nursing her baby and needed food badly. So did the men. Some were so ill that they could barely walk. The hungry travelers had to kill and eat a few of their horses. The mountain crossing lasted until late September. On the prairie below, the explorers met many Nez Perce Indians. They traded with them for food, and they stuffed themselves with berries, dried salmon, and bread made from camas roots. Captain Clark was one of those who ate too much. Now that they had crossed the mountains, the explorers did not need their horses until their return trip. The Nez Perce agreed to take care of the animals until then. Near what is now Orofino, Idaho, the travelers made 5 new canoes, and in early October, they resumed their journey. They paddled toward the Pacific Ocean. Once again, they ran out of food. They bought 24 dogs from Indians and ate them. In what is now eastern Washington, they reached the Columbia River. All along this great river, they met Indians. An all-male group would have alarmed the tribes, but when the Indians saw Sacagawea and Pomp, they welcomed the travelers. No woman ever accompanies a war party, Clark explained in his journal. As they neared the Pacific, rain began to fall, and it rained day after day. The Columbia River grew so wild that the voyagers felt seasick. Huge logs dashing against the shore nearly crushed their canoes. The rain filled their boat and rotted their clothing. Also, there were fleas. The fleas got inside what was left of the voyagers' clothes. The men were so itchy that they took off their rags and rode naked. Then came the moment they had long awaited. They could smell the ocean. On November 7th, 1805, they saw the ocean. Sacagawea and her baby had come more than 2,200 miles for this sight. For nearly a month, the explorers camped along the Columbia River's north shore. They were looking for a good place to spend the winter, but the rain did not let up. The men had trouble finding wood dry enough to start a fire. Byrd woman could not keep herself and Pomp warm or dry. One evening in late November, a Chinook Indian chief visited the camp. He wore a cape made of sea otter skins. Lewis wanted that cape. The explorers had spent all of their blue beads, so Lewis offered the chief 2 blankets for the cape. "I would not trade my coat for 5 such blankets," he answered. Then the chief saw Sacagawea's beautiful belt of blue beads. He wanted it as much as Captain Lewis wanted the cape. Sacagawea was forced to hand over her belt. Lewis got his cape. The captains gave Sacagawea a blue cloth coat in exchange, but her treasure was gone. By late November, the explorers had to pick a site for their winter quarters. They took a vote. Everyone, including Sacagawea and Clark's slave York, voted on where to build their fort. This was one of the rare times in this period of history that a woman or a slave was allowed to have an equal vote with white men. Sacagawea wanted to move to the other side of the Columbia River. A tasty root was available there. Janey, in favor of a place where there is plenty of wapato, Clark wrote. Most of their men also wanted to move across the river where they could hunt elk. The expedition crossed the Columbia, and as they did, they passed from Washington to Oregon. Near present-day Astoria, Oregon, the explorers began to build their winter home. They called it Fort Clatsop because the Clatsop Indians lived nearby. Most of December in 1805 was spent building Fort Clatsop. They had picked a good spot. There was enough wood to build the fort, and it had 6 rooms, each with a fireplace. The land was high enough to keep from flooding and the constant rain. Elk were plentiful. These animals provided meat as well as skins for new clothes. Chapter 6, Winter 1805 to 1806. While at Fort Clatsop, their explorers made more than 300 pairs of moccasins for the trip home. A pair of moccasins lasted just a few days. The explorers traded with the Clatsop tribe for cakes made of berries and for other food. The nearby ocean also had something valuable: salt. It was needed to flavor food and preserve meat for the return trip. To make salt, the men boiled seawater in large kettles, and when the water bubbled away, salt stuck to the sides of the pots. Then the men scraped off the salt and stored it. Around New Year's Day of 1806, the captains heard that a whale had washed up on the coast. Clark formed a group to get his oil and blubber. The blubber tasted like pork fat. This would be a treat for people who had eaten only wapato and elk for weeks. No one thought of including Sacagawea on the trip to see the whale. She felt hurt. She had traveled a great distance under terrible conditions with the men. She had saved their supplies. She had helped get them horses and found food for them and risked her life several times. And she had done all this while caring for her baby. She wanted to see the whale. Through her translation chain, Sacagawea spoke to Clark. "I have traveled a long way to see the great waters," she told him. "Now that you are going to see a monstrous fish, I think it very hard that I cannot go." So Captain Clark took her along to see the whale. Pomp's birthday fell on February 11th in 1806. By then he was starting to say a few words and to walk. Clark had grown to love the child, and he called him "my little dancing boy." Before Pomp went to sleep at night, Clark held him and sang to him. Early spring brought more excitement to Fort Gladstone. The Corps had spent 3.5 months in their winter quarters, and now it was time to head back home. On March 22nd, 1806, Lewis and Clark gave their fort to Gladstone Indian Chief. The next afternoon, they began their journey back to St. Louis. I'll stop there before chapter 7. This book is a lot shorter than our last one, but it's such a good story that I wanted to read it to you. So you might be wondering why they didn't just go to a grocery store to get food if they were so hungry, or why didn't they just go to a clothing store to buy clothes, or why didn't they stay in hotels? Why did they have to make their shelters everywhere they went? And the reason is because back then those things just didn't exist. So you can see how it was so hard for them to meet their fundamental needs because they had to do it with whatever was on the land. But Sacagawea was really good at knowing how to get food because she knew about the plants and roots and different things that were okay to eat. She had many helpful skills. I wonder if you'd like to do a fundamental needs chart that's about the Lewis and Clark expedition. So I'll attach it to this video in a document. But you know how it branches off as nutrition and defense and housing and clothing. And then there's spiritual needs too of religion and music and arts and culture and vanity. Well, maybe for the housing you can draw a picture of the housing that they made at some point. And then in another one, you could draw the pictures of the foods that they were eating. And you might have to do some additional research, but some of these things you already know. Like, how are they moving around? How did they travel so far? Sometimes they were using sailboats, sometimes they were using canoes that they made, sometimes they were on horses, sometimes they were walking. Or for the part about music, we did hear about how someone had a violin that they brought along. I would love to see your fundamental needs chart for the Lewis and Clark expedition. I hope that you choose to do that.